Hi. Hi. We're going to wait another minute just so other people can log in, but I'm Olivia Hinebaugh and I'm going to be talking about giving critiques, and I'm really excited. All right, I think we're at 2. I'm just going to give it till 2:01 before we start. Okay, so it is 2:01, so we're just going to get started. To introduce myself, I'm Olivia Hinebaugh. I'm a young adult author. I casually put my book right behind me. So my book is The Birds, the Bees, and You and Me, and it's a young adult contemporary story of a girl who goes to an abstinence-only sex education school in a small town, but she's like a super feminist, so she starts giving out safer sex advice and condoms and sprinkling knowledge and breaking stigmas. The paperback actually comes out on Tuesday, so it's been out for a year. And I have loved to being a published author in part so I can do stuff like this. I remember doing Write On Con. It was probably like 5 or 6 years ago, and I met one of my really dear friends who's local, and we read for each other. So talking about critiques is a very near and dear thing to my heart, especially with Write On Con. A little bit of my background and what I've done critiquing. Before I was an author or a novel writer, I studied playwriting and screenwriting and fine art and theater in college. And I think that gave me like a really cool foundation of knowing what it feels like to have your stuff put up in front of a bunch of people and just take the critique, particularly in fine art and design classes. Like your stuff is just up on a wall and it's kind of like a free for all. Anybody can say what they want. And you have a little bit of time to sort of like formulate what you want to say, but it's really just like gut reaction. And then in screenwriting and playwriting, what was cool about having that critiqued is it was always read aloud in class. So the dialogue you would write, you would get to hear an actual human saying it. And that is, for a lot of people, like a terrifying prospect, because if something doesn't work, you might know right away. But it's also invaluable because ultimately you want your words to be spoken and heard. When it comes to novel writing, I pretty much started in earnest thinking, okay, I'm going to be a novelist and I'm going to publish a novel back in 2012. So that was 8 years ago. And really, I think especially in those first 2 or 3 years of having a completed draft or 2 and trying to figure out about querying agents and, just really what I wanted to write, I think that I did almost as much critiquing and beta reading. I spent almost as much time doing that as I did writing. And I think that that was really valuable for me because I could see these things I was noticing in other people's writing and I could apply a more critical eye to my own writing. So I think not only does, offering to read for people, you're going to make connections. You're going to get your stuff read, which is invaluable. But you're also you just learn a lot through the process of giving a critique and looking at something with a critical but helpful eye. So on that note, I have a very lo-fi presentation. It's like literally, here we go, you can see. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is first considerations when you're setting out to do a critique for somebody. The first is how in-depth are you, first of all, do you want to go, and is the person whose work you're reading, do they want line edits? Or do they just want to know, yes, I loved it, this part of the story was great, just a general sort of discussion point. And your goals, when you're embarking on critiquing something, you want to be helpful, right? You want to be constructive, and that, basically means that they have something to build off of from what you give them, and it should be doable. And the reason I mentioned that is because there may be times where you read something and it's really not for you. It's not a genre that you read. It's not something that you're interested in. And you think that they should probably just scrap it and write something new. That's not going to be a helpful critique. So there's a little bit of matchmaking that goes into it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But just think, you want to hand them new ideas, fresh eyes, and the knowledge and perspective that you're coming from. So with that, things to keep your eye on when you're reading for somebody else. Got a nice list here. Okay. You're going to be paying attention to the characters. Obvious, it's kind of your entry point into the story. You should take note of pacing, especially if you find there are places where it's dragging. And that's something I think you just kind of know on a gut level. Do I want to turn the page or do I not care? You want to look at the prose and the style. You know, everybody's got their own voice, and you're not going to want to change their voice, but what you're going to want to do is say, hey, you got like super flowery over here, or I found a lot of these sentences over in this section kind of confusing and convoluted, things like that. Dialogue is a big one. This is me coming from a screenwriting, playwriting background. It has to sound good. It has to sound natural, and it has to just fit. And I think that's something when you're looking at your own work, sometimes it's really hard to notice. But when you're looking at somebody else's, sometimes it's a lot more obvious. Like, I don't think somebody would say that. You're going to be looking at the stakes and the tension and the story. And again, I think most people who read books have some idea of like the shape that it should have, that, you know, things should just get more and more tense and you should care more and more about the characters. And there should be a satisfying resolution. Another thing I find really helpful, especially for newer writers, it's really hard to know where to start your book, where to start your chapters and scenes, and where to end them. So I like to have an eye on, okay, the story really started being interesting right here, and like, can we drop the reader right in the middle of this? Or, wow, that's a powerful image, let's stop a chapter on that. Another thing that's it's way more nitpicky is timeline and logistics. Anybody who's drafted a novel knows sometimes you're like, I think 2 weeks have gone by, maybe. I don't know. But sometimes when you're reading something and you're really not sure how quickly things are happening or where people are at certain times, that's the kind of thing that you can point out and is really helpful. If you have any major questions when you're reading, and I think it's helpful to share, even like at the beginning, you're like, you keep hinting at so-and-so's something happened with their dad and we don't know what it is yet. It's nice to sort of jot that down. Like, I'm wondering about this. And then, you know, ideally that means that they will answer that question before the book is over. And then, are you confused anywhere? I mean, that's like one of the most important things to point out to somebody. Like, I need a little more here. I just had no idea who this person was or what they were doing, things like that. So those are all the things you're going to keep your eye on while you are reading. And then I also have some ideas for how you're going to present your critique. So I have, obviously, with a book published, I have revised to an edit letter where everything is basically, this character worked, this character didn't work. Here are things I think you should do, like big, long chunks of text explaining things. And that's certainly one way to do it. So you can choose to write essentially an edit letter, which you're going to maybe do a roundup of the characters and what you suggest by characters or what you suggest by setting or plot. You're going to break it down, but you're going to give yourself space to write down your thoughts. Another thing you can do is write in-line notes or comments. I kind of always recommend that you're doing this while you're reading, even if you're writing it in a notebook, and give your impressions as you're reading. They don't have to be perfect notes that you're necessarily going to show the person, but keep track of where you were, how you felt at these different parts, or where you're confused, and you're going to want to flag all of that. But it can be really helpful to hand somebody a manuscript that has your helpful notes that you've really gone through, and sort of, you have to edit your own notes to make sure they're helpful. But that's a super in-depth, obviously, read. Another thing you talk about and we hear about is something called the sandwich method. And that's basically this idea that what you're going to do whenever you start any critique is you're going to start saying, this is what's really working. This is what I really love about your story. Immediately, the person you're critiquing is going to feel more receptive because they don't think that you're not like, you're a hack and I hated this. You're like, this is really compelling. I wanted to read from the get-go. And then you're going to kind of like ease into here are the things that really weren't working. But when you sum up, because it's a sandwich made of nice things, hard things to hear, you're going to end on those positive notes of like, wow, but this was really great. The last thing is that I think is really helpful, even if you're passing off a manuscript with notes in it or an edit letter or something like that, is if you feel able and like you'd like to, is offering a chance to have a dialogue or brainstorm. Because I found, certainly as the critiquer and as the person who's being critiqued, sometimes that's sort of like the dialogue that happens after you give your thoughts. You find like a lot of what ifs, and it's just attacking things from a new perspective that can be so helpful in sort of like unlocking your story. And then here are some questions to answer as you're critiquing. Okay. How did the work make you feel? Right? As somebody who's written something, that's one of the first things I want to know. I want to know if the feeling hit you. What does it remind you of? That can be a really helpful tool. I mean, especially if you're going to go on to query something, like coming up with comp titles, like, oh, this really made me think of this and those things. Again, what did it make you wonder about? So what were those unanswered questions in the beginning that you really wanted to know? And especially if you didn't feel like it was a satisfying, like, what are you still, like, what piece of the story do you still feel like missing? What was confusing? And then which parts were slow and which parts were propelling? That's a huge part of it. It's impossible to know. I think when we're drafting, at least certainly me, it feels slow the entire time I'm drafting it. I don't really love drafting. And it's hard to be objective. So when somebody tells you, no, at this part, I was like totally hooked and I kept going, that's extremely helpful. And then there's just some little mechanical things, right? Could you picture the scenes happening as they were happening? Did the timeline, the setting, the characters, did it make sense and you knew who was in the scene and where they were and when it happened? Another thing that's really hard to tell by your own writing is overused words, phrases, or actions. And one I can think of is sometimes people just like shrug a lot or roll their eyes a lot, and it becomes sort of like that person's tell, like, this is the way I show this in my character. And overused words, man, those don't stand out in your own writing, but when you're reading somebody else's and you've read the same word like 20 times, you know. The length, I think it's good to know about how long most of the books in that genre are and then really try to aim for that. Little things like formatting. If someone's about to submit it, it should be, you know, double space, Times New Roman, all that stuff. And then if you notice any like grammatical mistakes kind of throughout, it's good to point out, sort of point them in the right direction for the tools or things that you notice they do over and over. Okay. And then another thing, when you're considering finding a new beta reader, and when I say beta reader, I mean they're just going to read one of your books once. You might ask them to beta for another one, but you're not looking for like a real partnership. That's what a critique partner would be. But a lot of critique partners come from betas that you really like working with. So one thing to consider when you're looking for betas is what phase of their career or process are they in. You don't have to be in the same place, certainly. And a lot of times it can be helpful to get critiques from people who are a little further along in the process. However, I find that the further along somebody is to their path of publication, the less time they have to read things multiple times and to be as helpful. So sometimes when you're just starting out and you're finding people to read for the first time, finding those people who are also learning, like you're learning together, you're going to have a little more time to devote to it. Ideally, you'll find people who read books in your genre. You just have to have that basis of knowledge. I would not choose, for example, I do read some science fiction and fantasy. I definitely do. But I read so much more contemporary, and that's what I write, that I would more readily maybe offer to read in those genres. Trade samples before you commit to reading a whole book. That's you have to sort of say it like neither of us is going to be offended, but if it's not for us, we're just going to say it up front. And that has to be okay, because you don't want somebody reading your book who's not going to like your book no matter what. And you don't want to read a book you don't like. So there's that. Share your goals and specific concerns ahead of time. Like if you've been told by somebody else, like this character was really unlikable, but you can't figure out, like that's not a great note. Your character's unlikable. It's more like, what things do you like about them or what do you not like? And then communication preferences. Some people want to be able to chat on Facebook. Some people want to just tweet at each other all the time. Some people don't want to like publicly acknowledge that they're having their work critiqued. Like figure all that kind of stuff out ahead of time. And then lastly, if you want to deepen that working relationship with this person, so you've read for each other, you love it. Like I said before, offer a chance to brainstorm, to have a dialogue, to put things back and forth and really be collaborative. Offer to read revisions or rewrites. That can be extremely valuable because you're the one who pointed out that this thing needs work, and that probably means you're going to know pretty well if what they change works. You can offer to help with a query or a pitch. I think it is helpful when you're writing a query to have people who both have read your manuscript critique it, and then have some people who have not read your manuscript critique it. That's helpful because if something's confusing, somebody who's never read your book is going to be confused. Somebody who's read your book is like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. But at the same time, somebody who's read your book is going to be like, wait a minute, you didn't talk about the most interesting thing in the whole thing. So that's something really great. And then eventually you can read newer or rawer, I don't know if there's a dash in there or what, things for each other. So I have a critique partner who, I mean, I'll be honest, sometimes I send her things like 20 minutes after I write it just because I want somebody to go, yeah, this is good, keep going. And then you can support other things like work-life balance, because that's something that's really challenging for writers. And then be encouraging, right? Like, I think we all need pep talks. So that's pretty much what I had to share with you guys from the get-go. So we're going to do some questions now. And I see the first question is, how can a writer make sure they're a good fit before they commit to critiquing someone's work? I think trading samples is a really, really great idea. If somebody's critiques are not helpful or they hurt your feelings, there's going to be some of that. There's going to be some of those hurt feelings, but you'll know if they've read 2 chapters that like maybe it's not a good fit. A good fit, a really good fit, is when the critiques that you receive spark something new in you and a new excitement in the work. And so either if you're the critiquer or the person receiving the critique, that sort of spark of new creative energy is what you need. And I think you know when it's there. If you're feeling really excited to get behind the keyboard and start fixing it, that's a really good sign. The next question, what are the pros and cons of meeting with a critique group in person versus having an online interaction with a critique partner? So to speak to this, my critique partner, and I have 2 people that, you know, I'm talking to about my writing all the time. And we support each other's, you know, lives as well. And we do meet each other in person quite a bit. And occasionally we say, hi, we're at a, you know, a coffee shop. And then we like say hello, how are things going? And we put our headphones on and ignore each other. And that just helps writing not feel lonely. I think just surrounding yourself with other people who are having similar goals is really, really, really beneficial. In addition to writing young adult, I'm trying to get published in picture books. And I took a great course through the Writing Barn where every week we'd read half of the class's manuscripts and we'd discuss each one in class. And I really, even though it was virtual, but it was like video chat, that was really helpful because even the people critiquing it could say, oh yeah, I had that too. So I saw the benefit of having multiple eyes at the same time on my work. I've never personally had like a dedicated critique group necessarily, more just that I do have friends that read for me that I happen to get to see in my day-to-day life, and that makes me very happy. I do think also though, when you're meeting in person or over like video chat like this, it is, you can feel a little more vulnerable. Sometimes it's easier just to read it. If you need to cry or sigh or like go do something else, like you have the space to kind of do that. So I think people know if they're feeling like, if you feel nauseous as soon as you hit send and it's, you know, it's going to destroy you when you get your notes, which a lot of people feel that way and it's fine. I could see preferring to just get an email for sure. Okay, and another question. When you dive into a critique partner's work, what's your usual process? Okay, so I will say what my process is. Okay. I read for the author Danielle Stinson. and she's somebody I've known since middle school. So at this point, we have a very close working relationship. And my process generally is I really want to read whatever she's written as soon as she's written it. So sometimes this means I read stuff that's not finished yet. I like to read straight through as much as possible. I don't like having 2 chapters a day. Like, I need to sit down, and some of that is because my own personal, I think, weakness in writing and reading is that I don't have a great memory for story, and in particular, nitty-gritty like language stuff. Like, my critique partner is great. She'll be like, oh, you changed this line, I like it better. And I go, did I? I don't even remember what it was. So it helps me to read all at once. I like to find, a chunk of time that I can really dedicate to it. And then I generally, I just use Google Docs, and I just read in the Google Doc, and I add comments as I have it. And I think, like I said, finding places where like, oh my gosh, I love this line. Like, don't ever get rid of this line. Having those kind of like line to line reactions is really great. And then I try to read the entire sample before I discuss it, just so that I know where everything was headed and I know where everything is coming from before I really start to, ask myself if things are working. I generally am somebody, I like to send people line notes. And I mean, I want them to get the good notes as much as the notes you need to work on this. Like, this was confusing. And I love saying like, oh my gosh, you killed me with this. I'm full of feels. Like, that's one of my favorite things to do. So that's normally my process. I have worked, like I'm doing pitch wars this year. So I have a mentee, and that was a little more like writing an edit letter, which is a little more work because I'm trying to organize my feedback in a way that's really digestible, but that is going to be like, I know, a lot of work. And so for that, I took a lot more time with the actual preparing how I was sending the critique. But I still have line notes all the time. So what are some of the most helpful critiques you've ever received? What are some of the examples of unhelpful critiques you've received, and how can we as writers avoid giving similarly unhelpful critiques? Okay, the most helpful critiques are ones that make me stop, think about something from a new vantage point, and go, oh my gosh, you're right, that would be so much better. So I'm not asking people who read my work necessarily to fix everything for me. Like, it would be great if they handed everything on a silver platter, like, this is the key to unlocking your story. That would be wonderful. A lot of times it's not that. It's like the what if questions. Well, what if we saw this earlier? What if you held this piece of information off? Can we play with the timeline? Can we play with the setting? Those kinds of notes are really helpful. And it is constructive. So it's something they're telling you, a thought, and you can just keep building on that thought until you've got a book you're really proud of. Unhelpful critiques. The one I would give you as the most unhelpful is when somebody just does not like a character. And the reason that's unhelpful, there's kind of 2 reasons. I think it's okay to dislike characters. First of all, I understand if you're going to be diving into someone's head and in their world, you want to be at least fascinated with them. So maybe the problem is actually that they're bored with them, but just like unlikable stuff. And I also just, like, as a feminist, I don't like when people say my female characters are unlikable, because I'm like, yes, sometimes they are. And then also, if something's not to somebody's personal taste, I mean, like, that's where you should figure that out, ideally before you have a working relationship with somebody. But like, man, if I wrote a sci-fi and somebody was like, I did not like all the space scenes, I'd be like, okay, so you probably wouldn't buy my book anyway. It doesn't matter. To avoid giving unhelpful critiques, just obviously your personal opinion is going to be in it, but if it's a matter of taste, that's not as relevant as something like, I think this specific thing could be better in this way. This could be deeper. This could be shorter. Things that are really concrete and sort of give an action, like just sort of a plan, like you got a game plan. Giving a piece of advice with just a small idea of game plan is the best way to just be helpful and not unhelpful. Okay, when you're reading a critique partner's work and you feel it's not ready for submission to agents, how can you share your feelings without hurting theirs? Okay. I'm going to speak for my own self, which is, gosh, I'd rather hear that from a beta reader or a critique partner than from an agent. Also, though, I like it. Like, I like to be ripped to shreds. Like, a lot of people don't enjoy that. It doesn't mean I don't like feel very vulnerable when that happens. I think one good example is when I got my first edit letter from my editor for that book. That book. She pointed out things that, like, as soon as she pointed it out, I was like, I cannot believe that is even in there. Why did I ever think that was a good idea? This is so horrible. I'm such a hack. And like those feelings lasted a couple of days and then it turned into action. So I tend to not pull my punches. I tend to be really brutally honest, but that's also something I would say up front. Like if something's not working for me, I'm gonna be like, nope, that doesn't work for me. I don't know what's going on. I don't think the stakes are high enough, whatever. Even if it's a big thing, if I think I can offer a solution and a way to tackle it, then I don't feel bad saying it. And I think also the people I work with more closely, I'm more likely to be like, nah, you got to do this again, I think. And particularly when you're writing like query letters, you have like 2 or 3 paragraphs. They have to be perfect. And so I'm not going to tell somebody that it's perfect and wonderful until it is. And actually having a critique partner say, hang on, make it better, again, is so much better than sending it to an agent and having the agent say, no, or I don't really like it, no. Even if they give you really good advice, like, don't you wish you had gotten that earlier in the process? Yeah, so I'm not saying you should be mean. I'm just saying if you really feel a certain way and it can be constructive, I say just go for it. And if we as writers receiving the critiques understand that that is the intention, that they're trying to help you get better, then it's a lot easier to receive that information. Even if you have to sit with it and cry for an hour, it's going to be better in the long run. How much time do you tend to take for different sized critiques? Okay. I love reading query letters, and I think that I do that in like 10 or 15 minutes. Recently with Pitch Wars, we had like probably similar to Write on Con, we had message boards where people could post queries or synopses, and we could critique it. And I would take 5 to 10 minutes to read it and try to understand it. And then I would take maybe 10 to 20 minutes to really line by line go like, maybe not this, maybe add this, maybe not this, maybe this. When it comes to reading an entire novel manuscript, and I'm mostly doing YA, it probably takes me 2 or 3 fairly dedicated days to get through an entire manuscript. Some people are a lot faster. I'm not the world's fastest reader. I tend to read at the pace at which I would speak it out loud, so it's pretty slow. But I think that the thing that's helpful for me is saying, I'm sitting down and I'm reading this. I'm reading it start to finish in 1 or 2 days, and that's going to be it, which is not how I read published books. I mean, I will spend 2 weeks reading a book sometimes, because if I put it down and I pick it back up, it's fine. I'm still going to enjoy the story. But when I'm critiquing, I tend to want to really stay in that mindset, keeping track of all the threads I'm trying to keep track of, and really, really, really be present. So I really try to dedicate a lot of time to that. Now that means now that I'm published and, I also write freelance, and I'm also a busy stay-at-home parent of 3 kids, I can't do that as often now. So I really only do that for my critique partners. And, it is the big time commitment, but I know that I get that time commitment back from the people who are critiquing my work. So, and it's one of my favorite things to do. I love to be able to just shut the world out and focus on a manuscript. So next question, if you are struggling to finish off a critique, either reading the piece or writing up your feedback, what should you do? I would love it. You could go back to the earlier part of this presentation and start asking yourself some of those questions. The basic thing, what's working, what's not working. If you can start with those questions, that's a great way to get the ball rolling. If you're finding that you're having a lot of trouble reading the end of the book, I might just be honest about that. If it's a matter of personal preference, or if it's a matter of like, this slowed way down, it's okay to give that feedback. I think in an ideal world, you would finish everything you start. But if you're really struggling, focus on the things that you think you really can offer this person, and be upfront about the things that you don't think you can offer them. Okay, so what do you do if you critique some writing that could use significant work or rewriting? And does that change depending on whether you're in a one-off critique or a long-term critique partner relationship? Okay, I think one of the great things about being a writer who's critiquing somebody's work and not being an agent or an editor is that you don't have to be the one to say, nope, not this book. You can just take that pressure off of yourself. However, I'm just not a fan of sugarcoating it. Like, sometimes I would say one of the most difficult things anybody would have to change, right, would be like, all right, you've built this world, you've built these characters, and you have this story, but your character does not have any agency. They're not making decisions. And really, as a reader, we need to see your character making decisions, making mistakes, and really being an active participant in the story. So that's a case where I feel like I have read things before where that's something that needs to change. And that's really hard. That's just really hard, because you're going to have to go back, take a step back, and possibly do huge rewrites. I tend, like I said, to not shy away from saying that. I know from experience of having to rewrite from the ground up multiple times on books that that's what you need to do a lot of the time. That's what needs to be done. It's very intimidating. My advice to anybody who's dealing with an edit letter or knowing that you're going to have to make big changes to the story is start with a blank document. I don't think any writer likes to take a paragraph that they loved and delete it. Like, that's really hard. But if you make yourself a map of how you think this rewrite should go, and hopefully, ideally, it does involve taking chunks of what was in your last draft and putting it in this new document. But there's something very freeing in that, because you can just focus on the things that you know are working and building on that. But I don't think that's ever easy to hear. So I know I've had to say to people, I would probably scrap that opening and do something different. I mean, that is really difficult. If you personally believe that something is not ready to be queried, that this writer needs more development, that they need to learn, they need to read more, whatever, I don't think you need to say that. You can just focus on the ways that you know that person can improve, and focus on that, because you have to lift this person up and challenge them at the same time. And just telling someone, I wouldn't query this book ever, is not as helpful as saying, hey, before I queried this, I would change all of these things. So, but those are hard conversations, and they're hard to hear them, and they're really hard to tell them. But I think, like anything else in writing, you practice and it gets a little easier. Okay, so another question is, what's the difference between a beta reader and a dedicated critique partner? For me, a beta reader is only ever going to see a completed manuscript, and I am expecting maybe not line notes, but just overall feelings, impressions, and suggestions. And I think when I was starting out, I did a lot of that for other people, and I had a lot of people do that for me. Now that I've found these close relationships with certain critique partners, things work a little differently. Sometimes I really need to like vent and complain about how much I hate writing the scene, and I will text them and say, I really hate writing this scene. I think that I like to include them earlier in the process. Like, when I have even just, a plot bunny idea, I share it with them immediately and start, brainstorming and spitballing and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's, with my critique partner, certainly, it's like they're there from the ground level. Like, they have known where you have started with this story, and they have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of a lot of what you've written. And a lot of that is like comfort. I'm extremely comfortable sending something I know probably is going to have grammatical mistakes to my critique partners because I know that they know that I'll fix it or whatever. And at least in my case, my critique partners are basically my best friends. And I realize that's sort of an ideal situation. And I feel really blessed to be in that situation. But I think that they do a lot more than support my writing through critiquing. They do a lot of lifting up, encouraging, cheerleading, listening to vents, all that kind of stuff. And I really trust them because they have told me the hard things. They have told me when things aren't working. And they've always helped me make my stuff better. So I think when you find that person who makes your stuff consistently better and that you feel okay sending your messy thoughts to or your messy feelings, like that is a critique partner, and that person is pure gold, and you should want to help that person as much as they help you because you will get so much out of it. Finding that person can be really hard, but like I said, when I started writing, I was reading for a lot of people, and some of them I've kept up with, and I've read some of their books. I haven't read some of their books, but I've enjoyed watching them have a career for a lot of them, like people I read before they had an agent, before they were published, and now they're published. That's just an amazing thing to have been a part of. Okay. The next question is, after reading multiple revisions of the same manuscript, do you think your critique partner could get too close to the work to provide good feedback? That's a really good question. I think that it's always beneficial if you can find some fresh eyes. I think, even if you're in the process and you have one critique partner that you really send a lot of stuff to, it can always be good to send it to one new person. But I see a lot of benefit in having that person who has seen the stuff that wasn't as good. When they see you improve it and they go, yes, you have improved that, and I see it for sure now. That's extremely beneficial. And for my critique partners, I don't mind reading the same book 20 times. I really don't. I mean, part of it is they're my critique partners because I love them and I think they're very talented. So yeah, I guess, yeah, ideally, like the freshest thoughts are going to be the first time you read it, but some of the really helpful, check back in. Yes, this really works now where it wasn't working before. Like that's really helpful too. You mentioned that you offer critique on query letters to your critique partners. Do you critique other things like outlines, log lines, titles? Yes. I hate coming up with titles. And furthermore, I want to say that I do have this sort of like separate support group. So I'm really, really, really lucky. Shout out to the Swoon Squad. The imprint publisher that I worked with, all of the authors are extremely close. We talk a lot about how it's going, checking in, but we brainstorm titles a lot. And I think we all kind of struggle with that. I think also the more you've done this, so I'll say I have queried 5 novels and some picture books. I feel pretty solid in my ability to give somebody a query critique. And I know that my critique partners similarly have had a lot of experience to the point where the query that they wrote for their book is now the jacket cover copy. Like it's what's used on Amazon to describe their book. But I always ask for eyes on that. And especially when you have to do something like a chapter by chapter synopsis, which I don't like doing because I'm not a plotter, I would definitely show that stuff. I think if you found somebody that you trust, you show them everything that you're going to show your agent or your editor. Just go through them first. And I sort of expect to help them with the same stuff. Okay, this is a good question. When a critique partner's feedback is consistently only thoughts and positive remarks, is it time to have a talk with them to establish that you need constructive criticism, or is it time to find a new critique partner who's a better match? I have a couple thoughts on this. And the first is that I think we could all use a little more cheerleading in this process and in this industry. I know that my critique partners that read for me as far as I know, they enjoy reading my work. But sometimes that is actually what I really need, is I need somebody to be like, please keep going. Please keep going. This is great. Please keep going. And I also think that the further you are in this process, if you are going to be working with an agent and an editor, a lot of that criticism is going to start to come from them. But if you're still in the querying stage and you're probably not going to have somebody professional read it yet, I would absolutely be like, please tell me what's not working. And if you've had that established trust where you know for sure that in the past they have told you this is not working, you should work on it. When they tell you it's working, it probably is working, and you can just be trustful of that. But if you're ever questioning and you want to get a fresh pair of eyes, get a fresh pair of eyes. Let's see. What are some ways a critique partner can show enthusiasm beside just saying nice things in the critique itself? I have a lot of thoughts on this. It's really, I don't know what I would do. People say it's a crazy industry. It is. There's a lot of stuff that's just out of your control and is really hard to deal with. And I think having a sounding board to say when things are disappointing or are not, going as planned or are frustrating, I think that is really useful. Like, it's really helpful to just complain to somebody sometimes. And when there's things like, if you're doing pitches on Twitter during like PitMad, you retweet their pitches. Or if you are keeping an eye out for which agents are saying, hey, we're looking for this, and you're like, oh my gosh, you should send them your book. That's a totally perfect fit. Like, these are ways we can support each other throughout the process. And another way is, hey, do you want to go to a coffee shop and ignore each other and work for 2 hours? That's a lot of encouragement I really need. Is more feedback more beneficial, or is too much feedback too much? That is a very good question. I think you have to look at what stage you're in. So the example I have is when I was editing my book with my editor, her first edit letter didn't, she wasn't telling me which lines she thought were really funny. She wasn't taking up 2 pages to tell me how funny the dialogue was, right? So I needed the broad strokes. I needed to know what was working, what wasn't working, what subplots had to go. And I mean, we cut out subplots. We combined multiple characters into one character. I mean, stuff I had to rewrite almost all of it. So I think it would have been too much at that stage in things to hear about this line of dialogue or to hear about you overuse this word, because it wouldn't have mattered. I rewrote those scenes anyway. But then when you're in the later stages of things, the story is how it's going to be, the scenes are how it's going to be, and these characters are going to have these discussions. I want to know if one line of dialogue sounds weird, right? And I would like the more comments I have during line edits or copy edits, the more bubbles that are there, like, I feel the better, because I know that this person has really considered every little thing. But if I had gotten that at the beginning, along with, hey, you need to cut this character, that would have been too much. So I think you have to know where you are in the process and what kind of feedback they're looking for. Okay, how do you approach a critique when dealing with potentially problematic material? How can you deliver that type of feedback in a way that will make your critique partner receptive to feedback? That is a really good question, because it's really, really hard to hear that something you have written is problematic. I think now there are more and more, people who use something called a sensitivity reader, and that person might be of the identity of the character you're writing, which is especially important if you are not that identity, but it's still important even if you are. But it's somebody who is of that identity and is well-versed in, which tropes are problematic, which things, might point to ableism or racism, even if that's not what you meant. And pretty much, nobody is meaning to be sexist or ableist or racist in the writing. That's, we all want to avoid harm in our books. Okay, so actually delivering that news is probably very difficult. I have in the past, like there are some areas that I feel like I could almost be a sensitivity reader in these areas, and I will just straight up say, this is a harmful trope. This harms real people in real life because it's told over and over and over in stories. It demonizes a certain kind of character or whatever. If something's truly, truly harmful and you don't think that there's a way they can fix it, I think you have to say, I'm not a good person to read this for you because I found this extremely problematic. And I think if you're going to proceed with this material, you need to spend a little time listening to other people's advice and seek out a sensitivity reader. And then please, I know writers are not rich, but if you really want to write a story and you really need a sensitivity reader, please try to pay them. We don't want to ask for free labor from people, especially those in marginalized populations and communities. So that's hard. And I will say receiving that kind of feedback is really hard. In The Birds, the Bees, and You and Me, there is an asexual character. And so we had two asexual sensitivity readers who know about all the TV shows and all the books out there and how they handle with asexuality and which things are helpful and which things aren't. And one of the most helpful things I heard was like, here is a term that we don't get to hear enough, and it's something that we all think about. And if you could include that in your writing, it would mean a lot to the asexual community. And even though I'm on the ace spectrum myself, I was not nearly as aware of all that's out there in terms of the media and, the problematic tropes or whatever. But it was really hard to hear that. It was really hard to hear that I didn't do like a perfect job from the get-go writing a character whose identity was similar to mine. So I know how that feels to get that feedback, and it's hard. It almost feels like you're being critiqued for your own identity, but really that's not it. It helped me take this character who is not me and have her here doing her thing. And while I'm at it, hopefully I put some food for thought for people who aren't, who don't know anything about the asexual spectrum. Okay, if you end up not being a good fit for critiques, how do you handle the let's just be friends conversation? I think it helps if you almost do like a prenup agreement. Start just trading chapters, and with the expectation of, if I say you're not a good fit, I don't have to tell you why, and you can do the same thing for me. I think it's really important. Like, again, that's going to suck to hear, like somebody just doesn't want to read the rest of your work. Like, that's not fun to hear. But if you have that expectation going into it, that either of you can sort of break up as beta readers for, a lot of different reasons, then that is fine. I'm not saying you should white lie either. Like, people are busy. If you find that you're too busy to read for this person anymore, say you're too busy to read for them anymore and you're really sorry. And if you happen to know somebody else who's looking for a beta reader, like, be a matchmaker. See if you can help them, give them resources you know of to find another person to read. You mentioned that you worked with critiquers you met through WriteOnCon. Can you explain how you found him or her? It's been a really long time. But the author, Christina June, has 3 books out now. She and I were on the message boards on WriteOnCon, and we noticed we both lived in the same part of Virginia, and we met up at a Panera one day. And in our case, she was writing young adult contemporary. I was writing young adult contemporary. Neither of us were agented yet. We were at the same phase of the process. So we were reading, manuscripts for each other, but also query letters and sort of sharing notes on agents, all that kind of stuff. Because the critique partners I still work with, at least one of them, my friend Danielle, we've known each other since middle school. We didn't really have to find each other. But at the same time, she writes more like fantasy sci-fi, and I love fantasy and sci-fi, but was writing mostly contemporary. So when I met Christina on WriteOnCon, it was really exciting to me to find somebody else who was writing young adult contemporary with love stories, with romance. And I think, yeah, we had probably enjoyed reading each other's queries. And then we enjoyed reading each other's full manuscripts. But I wouldn't consider us now critique partners. I don't read everything she writes. She doesn't read everything I write. But I would for sure ask her to beta, and I would offer to beta for her too. So we are now out of time. It says, oh, I see that this has been 50 minutes. So I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for tuning in. Find me on Twitter, shoot me a question if we didn't get to it. And I hope you guys have a great time doing Write On Con and you meet lots of fabulous people. So thanks so much. We'll sign off.